Hello, my name's Dr. Val Derbyshire and I'm an Impact Officer and Researcher at the University of Derby. My specialist area of research is Romantic literature. That's both literature of the British Romanticism, so literature dating from 1780 up to the Victorian period, but I also write and research on Romantic literature with a small r, as in fiction about romance. So I completed my doctoral research in the works of this author, Charlotte Smith, who lived from 1749 to 1806, and she was a poet, a novelist, and a writer of educational works for children. Smith was writing during the period I'm going to be talking about today, the Romanticism. Now, when I think about the Romanticism, this is one of the most popular images that comes to mind. It's Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, dating from 1818, and this is a great image to illustrate the ideal of the Romanticism. Here we've got a solitary figure perched on top of an eminence, adopting the traditional privileged stance of the male poet. He's standing up on high, overlooking the landscape, ready to start reciting poetry. And much romantic poetry starts from this position. If we look at the title and the opening lines of William Wordsworth's Lines Left Upon a Seat in a Yew Tree, which stands near the Lake of Esthwaite on a desolate part of the shore, yet commanding a beautiful prospect. For example, you can see that the poet starts off in a prominent place. In the scene, he's far from all human dwelling, i.e. he's in an isolated spot, yet in a commanding position over the landscape. Of the later Romantics, Percy Bysshe Shelley adopts a similar stance in his Mont Blanc, Lines Written in the Vale of Chamonix. So here we've got probably the most famous Romantic poets, and these are generally what we would call the Big Six. So we've got William Wordsworth, and he wrote one of my favourite Romantic poems, which is also probably one that's very well known to you, the Daffodils poem, which starts, I wandered lonely as a cloud. No doubt it will be familiar to you. Also in the Big Six, we've got Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote the famous Ancient Mariner poem. There was an ancient mariner, he stoppeth one of three. There was William Blake. He was an artist, an engraver, and a genius who wrote the famous Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright poem. Again, you'll probably have heard of that one. Percy Shelley wrote the famous Skylark poem, Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert. And John Keats wrote the famous Autumn poem, Seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness. And finally, of the Big Six, there's George Gordon Lord Byron, whose reputation precedes him. Described by portrait painter James Northcote as being so handsome it hurt your eyes to look upon him, he was probably the most flamboyant of the Romantics. He was famously described by Lady Caroline Lamb as mad, bad and dangerous to know. And he was a prolific poet and wrote many famous poems that you will have heard of. Don Juan, She Walks in Beauty, etc. On the slide here, we've got the opening to my personal favourite of Byron's works, a poem called Darkness. And this is an apocalyptic poem. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Now, the date of composition for this poem is really important. You can see there, it's the summer 1816, and that was described as the year without a summer. For Byron, this is a dream which is not all a dream. It's got one foot in reality. This was because Mount Tambora, a volcano in Indonesia, had a massive eruption in 1815, which caused an ash cloud which spread across Europe and basically blocked out the sun in the summer of 1816. Weather was abysmal all year, and some people felt that the world was ending. Hence Byron's apocalyptic poem. Incidentally, this event also inspired the circumstances that led up to Mary Shelley's writing of Frankenstein, which was published in its original version in 1818. But I'll be speaking more about Frankenstein in another recording. So that is the Big Six anyway. However, if I had the choice, I would add one more to this, John Clare. He was a working class poet from Northampton, and again, a genius. He spent some of his life in a lunatic asylum, and this is my favourite romantic poem of his. I am, yet what I am none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. They rise and vanish in oblivion's host, like shadows in love's frenzied stifled throes, and yet I am and live like vapours lost, into the nothingness of scorn and noise, into the living sea of waking dreams, where there is neither sense of life or joys, but the vast shipwreck of my life's esteems. Even the dearest that I love the best are strange, nay rather stranger than the rest. I long for scenes where man hath never trod, a place where woman never smiled or wept, there to abide with my Creator God, and sleep as I in childhood sweetly slept, untroubling and untroubled where I lie, the grass below, above the vaulted sky. As you can see, John Clare was one of the later Romantics, and this poem was composed 20th December 1846, and it was actually published around 1848. It was written here at the Northampton Lunatic Asylum, where Clare was a patient at the time. This poem, in some ways, offers a window into the tortured soul of a man caught in the throes of a mental breakdown. However, it's also entirely typical of the Romantic movement. Clare starts on the precipice of his madness and ends by trying to resolve himself in nature, much as other Romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge and Shelley attempt to do in their poems. For Clare, the frenzied attack of his sorrows, his woes, can only be resolved by scenes of isolated nature, the grass below, above the vaulted sky. So let's take a look at those big six Romantic poets for a moment and have a think about what's missing from this picture. Who isn't represented here? Well, the answer is nearly everybody is not represented here. They're all white men. Which begs the question, can anybody name any female Romantic poets, for instance? Well, even if you can, and well done if you can, they won't be as well known as the famous household names of the male poets. So you might be forgiven for thinking that there were no women writing poetry at this time, but nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, there were more famous women poets at that time and more women writing poetry than men. And on this slide, we've got just a few of them. So here we've got Anna Barbold, a famous poet and writer of educational works for children. Now, no portrait remains of Barbold, but it's thought that this cameo was based on her profile. It was probably completed by the Wedgwood family, who she had links with. And this is really interesting, an interesting find from the Derby Local Studies Library. But whilst researching in there, I stumbled across this. And this is Joshua Wedgwood's autograph, which is held in the Local Studies Library. During that time, people used to write away and collect autographs from famous people, much like they collect autographs today. And so there are lots of these sorts of letters and signatures that have ended up in archives up and down the country. Also on this slide, we've got Hannah More. She wrote a sizable, 6 sizable volumes of verse. Anna Seward was known as the Swan of Litchfield, and she was so popular that her poetry went through successive editions, and she even wrote a poetical novel entitled Louisa. Helen Maria Williams, who was on the front line of the revolution of France, was here as well. Her letters sent back to England at the time formed the very first journalistic accounts from a war zone and became the basis for how the French Revolution was reported in some newspapers. She was imprisoned during the revolution. She was actually quite lucky to escape with her life. Also, we've got Mary Robinson, the one-time lover of the Prince of Wales, known as Perdita. As a poet, she was able to maintain herself after the prince abandoned her, and who, the year before her death in 1800, could survey the literary landscape and see it was dominated by women intellectuals. So thinking about that big six, those big six male white poets, it only provides one view of Romanticism. And in fact, there are so many interpretations of Romanticism. Critics these days rather prefer to term it Romanticisms, because when looking at a period, researchers should try and capture a multitude of viewpoints, that make up any society. It is such a massive subject that anyone talking about it needs a way into it. So with this in view, what I'm going to do is focus my research on the poetry of Charlotte Turner Smith. And I'm going to talk about that in some detail. Then I'm going to look at a couple of other poets and interesting poems from the area, from the Romantic poets that might come up in GCSE. And what we'll find, I think, is that there are parallels between the tropes of all these Romantic poets, which we can trace throughout this type of poetry. So I'm going to start with my absolute favourite poem of the Romantic era. No apologies here. And it's not by any of the big six, it's by Charlotte Smith. And it is the fabulously titled On Being Cautioned Against Walking on the Headland Overlooking the Sea because it was frequented by a lunatic. And it goes thus. Is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff with starting pace or slow, and measuring views with wild and hollow eyes its distance from the waves that child below? Who as the sea-born gale with frequent sighs chills his cold bed upon the mountain turf, with hoarse half-uttered lamentation lies, murmuring responses to the dashing surf. In moody sadness on the giddy brink, I see him more with envy than with fear. He has no nice felicities that shrink from giant horrors wildly wandering here. He seems, uncursed with reason, not to know the depth or the duration of his woe. It has this fantastic title, but it also came complete with this lovely engraving by William Heath, who copied it from a painting by Richard Barbold, who was a famous artist of the day. And this gives us this rather picturesque lunatic. So looking at the poem and the picture and the poem together, one has to ask oneself, who is the narrator in this poem? Is it the lunatic? Is it the author? Is it somebody else? Because in some ways it's hard to separate the narrative voice, the poetic voice of Charlotte Smith's work from her biography. So in order to answer the question about who's the intended speaker here, we need to know a little bit more about the poet. So here are some key facts about Charlotte Smith's life. She was of the upper classes. So as you can see from the frontispiece to her elegiac sonnets, she was of Bignor Park in Sussex. She lived in a large house on the South Downs in Sussex. She was landed gentry. And what's more, she wanted her readers to know this by announcing her aristocratic heritage on the front page of her book and telling her readers exactly who she was. That said, her family were really poor. Her father remarried a rich woman to mend his fortunes, and Charlotte's new mother just didn't want her around. In fact, she married Charlotte off to a chap called Benjamin Smith at the age of just 15. Charlotte Smith knew virtually nothing about the man she was marrying. She says in her letters she had barely danced with him before she married him. Yet strangely, she seems to have at one time loved him. They were together for 22 years and they had 12 children together before the public complaints began. Smith peopled her novels with autobiographical characters. In her third novel, Celestina, which was published in 1791, she included the older heroine, Mrs. Elphinstone, a woman who married at the same age as Charlotte herself to a feckless husband who squandered her fortune. On looking back at the early days of her marriage, Mrs. Elphinstone says, "But I loved him. He was the most cheerful and sanguine creature in the world, and he painted to me only scenes of prosperity and happiness, which I was well pleased to contemplate as true representation." And it's really tempting to read these lines as true representation as well, given the autobiographical similarities of Smith and her character as an indication of how she felt during those first years with her husband. Sadly, her happiness for either herself or her characters was not destined to endure. Smith was a victim of domestic violence at the hands of Benjamin Smith. Within her private letters and the prefaces to her public works, Charlotte Smith would later openly chastise him as a worthless and wicked biped. She termed him whose name she had the misfortune to bear. He was also dishonest. In 1783 he was arrested for debt and embezzlement, and Smith, because of the laws during the 18th century, went to prison with him and spent some of her time in jail here at Newgate. During the 18th century, the wife of man was what was termed femme couvert. She was literally his property. So during that time, women had the same rights as lunatics and children, i.e. none. So Charlotte went to prison with her husband, and it was from here, not Bignor Park in Sussex, that she actually wrote those sonnets. So what do we think now about the speaker in this poem? The poem starts with a question. Is there a solitary wretch who hies to the tall cliff with starting pace or slow? Is there? The poetic eye of the poem, the speaker, doesn't know, because she's not actually there. This is an imaginary walk on the headland, and from this opening question, the construction of the lunatic is entirely imaginary. He measures views with wild and hollow eyes. That's what she imagines a lunatic would look like. In her imagination, he stands in moody sadness on the giddy brink. However, those last 5 lines of the sonnet marks a sharp alteration in the speaker's voice. I see him more with envy than with fear. Suddenly, we're not on an imaginary journey anymore, viewing a supposed lunatic. We're actually inside the poet's mind now. I see him more with envy than with fear. This is how she feels. He has no nice felicities that shrink from giant horrors wildly wandering here. He seems uncursed with reason not to know the depth or the duration of his woe. By felicities, she means sensibilities, finer feelings, which would traditionally in the 18th century society be attributed to a woman. And this poem is all about the place of women in that society and the double bind which faced women by laws of coverture. He seems uncursed with reason not to know. Remember that women at this time were more like lunatics and children and not considered to have any reason of their own. Lord Chesterfield, in a letter to his son of 1748, recorded the popular view. Women then are only children of a larger growth. They have an entertaining tattle and sometimes wit, but for solid reasoning good sense I never knew in my life one that had it, or who reasoned or acted consequentially for 24 hours together. It's hard to believe, but this is how men genuinely viewed women. But Charlotte Smith was an intelligent, reasoning woman. She, unlike the lunatic, is cursed with enough reason to know the depth and the duration of her woe, or in other words, the terrible injustice of her place as a woman in 18th century society. So you can see here there are ways this poem is autobiographical. However, there are also ways that it is not. We know, for instance, that despite what the poem seems to tell us, Charlotte Smith has not actually walked on the headline. She's not actually seen the lunatic as is portrayed here in the accompanying picture. Now, the picture which accompanies this sonnet is incredibly important in the reading of it. Smith was a middle-aged woman at the time, and you can just about make out from this picture that the woman in the background, ostensibly regarding this lunatic, has the figure and dress of a middle-aged woman. This is not the figure of a young heroine. It links the poet with the poem and places within it even more. Smith, within her elegiac sonnets, was accused of selling her sorrows, using her public's pity for her to raise money, which she always needed, and to get them to buy her novels and poetry. She adopts a tragic persona, the romantic female figure in the background of the engraving, and this is her poetic persona. It's a way to sell books and appeal to the romantic spirit of the times. So within the prefaces to her successive editions of the sonnets, Smith addressed her readers, giving personal appeals, revealing to them her suffering at the hands of her husband and her financial difficulties as a single mother. Critic Sarah Zimmerman argues the following of Smith's poetic persona. In all of her writings, Smith presents her case to the public in the prefaces, letters, poetry, prose works, and even in the novels. She depicts herself as a woman wronged by a profligate husband and by a society that excuses his financial abandonment and his emotional and physical abuse. By offering an account of indigence in the language of sensibility, Smith presented herself as a sympathetic figure to a public familiar with tales of women's suffering from sentimental novels that followed the example of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa. In elegiac sonnets, Smith assumed a role that was already available, the heroine of sensibility. But she revitalised the story by providing her readers with details from her own life, an ongoing plot. The prefaces that open most of her works became in effect a serialised autobiographical narrative. So Smith, in other words, provided her readers with an almost soap opera detailing her own life. Readers felt that they were really getting the true Charlotte Smith by reading her poems, and this stance worked well too in gaining her favourable reviews. Critics hardly ever reviewed her poems without commenting directly on her personal life. They chivalrously leapt to the defence of the respectable gentlewoman in distress, neglecting Smith's technical and imaginative achievements as a poet. She was a fine writer, her critics said, but they spent most of the time offering their condolences to her as the woman, struggling to support many children and to maintain her upper middle-class status. Reviewers preferred dealing with the wronged gentlewoman rather than the existential poet. We are sorry to see the eye which can shine with so much poetic fire sullied with a tear, and we hope the soothings of the muse may wipe it from her cheek, said the Critical Review in 1786. This present volume is said to have been composed under the heavy pressure of difficulties and amid heart-rending sorrows. It pains us to hear so frequently of this lady's misfortunes, said the Monthly Review. However, there's a big problem with this interpretation of Charlotte Smith's poetry. As we've seen from The Lunatic, these sonnets are not based on tales told as true. She's never been on the headland. She's never seen The Lunatic. The titles of her other poems also raise questions about the genuine nature of the poetic speaker. For example, there's a whole series of poems which are translations from Petrarch and actually detail his fictional tragic love affair with Laura. Similarly, there's an entire series supposed to have been written by the hero of sensibility of the time, taken from Goethe's incredibly popular novel, The Sorrows of Young Virta. In this novel, young Virta meets and falls in love with Lottie, but she's already engaged to be married. Hopelessly in love, the novel ends with him committing suicide. Obviously, these elegiac sonnets were based on the fictional sorrows of a fictional character, so in no way can be considered real. Yet Smith muddies the waters further by linking her own name, Charlotte, with Virta's love, which was Lottie. The tear shall tremble in my Charlotte's eyes, dear precious drops, they shall embalm the dead. Yes, Charlotte, o'er the mournful spot shall weep, where her poor Virta and his sorrows sleep. And she puts her own name in capital letters. Professor Stuart Curran, a leading scholar in Charlotte Smith studies, has justly challenged naive autobiographical interpretations of Smith's sonnets. He writes, what even the most cursory reading across the sonnets reveal is how seldom they relate to the actual terms of her existence. The question of who is the poetic I, the speaker, in romantic poetry is a really interesting one. And if we return to Wordsworth's Daffodils, for example, the poem itself seems to indicate that the poem has been constructed because the poet saw some daffodils and celebrated them in verse. In actual fact, we know that this poem, written in 1804, was based on an event recording in his sister's, Dorothy Wordsworth's diary from 1802, so some 2 years later. This is what she wrote in her diary. When we were in the woods beyond Gowborough Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the lake had floated the seed ashore and that the little colony had so sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and yet more, and at last, under the boughs of the trees, we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful they grew among the mossy stones about them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever dancing, ever changing. This wind blew directly over the lake to them. There was here and there a little knot and few stragglers and few yards higher up, but they were so few as not to disturb the simplicity and unity and life of that one busy highway. We rested again and again. The bays were stormy, and we heard the waves at different distances and in the middle of the water, like the sea. The poem itself, then, was then further revised from some 11 years later, in 1815. So does this poem, a poem constructed from a memory, which was not really Wordsworth's own memory, tell us anything about the actual poet? One has to ask oneself, who is the poetic I in this poem? However, this poem does tell us something about the poetic I, as in the eye you see with, rather than the eye of the self. So if we look at this last stanza, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. This is the inward eye of the poet, and how the poet sees is a central concern in romantic poetry. During this period in history, the aesthetics of the time were incredibly important to artists, and there were three key artistic movements which have a deep impact on the poetry of the time. So there was the picturesque, which was characterised by such artists as George Smith of Chichester, who this is one of his works, Landscape with a Castle on a Hill. And this was an artist from whom Charlotte Smith took drawing lessons as a child. So the picturesques feature things like broken grounds and ruins like the castle here. Then there was the beautiful and the sublime. So Turner specialised in sublime painting, like this one, The Wreck of a Transport Ship from 1810. And the sublime as an aesthetic movement is the one which really interests me in terms of romantic poetry. Philosopher Edmund Burke wrote a treatise on the difference between the sublime and the beautiful. And in short, the beautiful, according to Burke, is what is well formed and aesthetically pleasing, whereas the sublime is what has the power to compel and destroy us. Terror, obscurity, darkness, loss of control, anything that is on the immense scale or grand in either height or size, Burke's theory was sublime. The sublime comes through in romantic poetry all the time. Now, one of the poets you might consider is William Blake, himself an artist, or an ingenious engraver, as Charlotte Smith termed him. On the right of the slide here, we've got The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun from 1805, and you can see that this embodies the sublime aesthetic. Here we have the terror of the dragon, a woman clothed in immense, unknowable, unmappable body of the sun, darkness surrounding them, obscure and faint impressions of people which the viewer can only just make out lie beneath them. His poetry is full of sublime imagery. If we look at London from Songs of Experience, this really comes through. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the harlot's curse blasts the newborn's infant's tear, and blights with plague the marriage hearse. So here Blake starts from a position of control. The streets of London and Thames are chartered, they're mapped. Similarly, the populace sits under the control of the state, the mind-forged manacles. The original version of this poem read the German-forged links, which was a reference to the House of Hanover, or the monarchy of the time. But even from this position of control, already things start to slip into uncontrollability and the obscure, fear, woe, emotions which can't be controlled and which embody the sublime. Following the sublime aesthetic, the final two stanzas start to lose control completely, and they slip beyond the boundaries of the strictly mapped London streets. Here Blake starts to invoke the most sublime imagery of all. The terror of war threatens the supposedly civilised streets and threatens to rain down. Metaphorically at least, blood running down the palace wall. It's an image of horror, the city washed in the blood of the wars being fought for a remote monarchy. The soldier, it seems, that has no choice about this. He is, as Blake tells us, hapless, a poor unfortunate drafted in to fight a war he might not even necessarily believe in. It's worth remembering that lots of the wars of the time, including the American Revolutionary Wars in the 1770s and the French Revolutionary Wars of later, were very unpopular. Even the immense deity of God, Blake seems to imply, is appalled by what there is to see on the streets of London. Every blackening church appalls. There is displeasure on an apocalyptic scale. Who dares to incur the wrath of God? Then there are the unseen horrors, the plagues and disease and the rotting streets which silently threaten the populace, referred to here in the final lines in this reference to venereal disease. Passed from youthful harlots, so young women with no choice but to turn to prostitution, to their innocent children. In 4 stanzas, the chartered streets of London, which are so civilised and so ordered, have descended into disordered squalor, which they actually comprise if we see Gustave Doré's London slums picture. Most of these big 6 romantic poets that you might study as part of your GCSE will access the aesthetic of the sublime in their works, and it's interesting to read the theory of the aesthetic alongside these poems. Considering the tropes of the sublime, the terror, the darkness, the uncontrollability, the obscurity, and reading them into the poems as narrative devices can provide a new insight into what the poet was trying to say in terms of the critiquing their own society, in what their poetic eye, as in the eye that could see, could actually see. Other visual arts play into poetry as well, as we can see from this slide. So we go back to Charlotte Smith, and she accesses the sublime in her poetry, but she also uses characters that you might term picturesque, like the lunatic we looked at before. The picturesque use broken grounds, ruins, and stressed instability, like the lunatic himself, an unstable character. The picturesque, as we have seen with the lunatic, could be used to critique society too, and the instability of how 18th century society operated in terms of justice for all, as in both men and women. So, to conclude then, the two elements I've focused on here are the poetic eye, as in the self. Who is the poet in romantic poetry? Is it always the author, or is it rather a matter of construction of the self? Romanticism was a time which celebrated individuality and imagination, and yet how genuine is this in the poetry of the time? Secondly, the poetic eye, as in the eye the poet sees with. The aesthetics of the time were incredibly important to artists, and lots of poets were accessing the tropes of visual artwork and including them within their own poetry. Blake was both a visual artist and a poet. Smith enjoyed botanical illustration, and some of her best poems and her most personal ones are ones which are constructed through this medium. With this in view, I believe that you can't ever really remove the visual, how the poet sees, from romantic poetry. Thank you.